Okay, in this video we're just going to be dealing with sculpting a frequency response. So let's just jump right into it. What do we have to work with? If you have watched the videos up to this point, you've got a pretty good understanding of what a frequency response is. So what can we do with it? First of all, we can tune it. We can shape the response, the slope, the ADSR, and all those type of things. We can time stretch and compress the response. We can equalize the frequency response of the impulse response. We can do sound sculpting it to wave shape it to where its characteristics are more complementary to, say, a violin or a drum or whatever instrument you might be dealing with. We can shape it more with other equalizations or other tools to shape the dampness, population, reflexivity. And we can also shape it with other impulse responses with the convolution reverb. We can actually superimpose other impulse responses on top of impulse responses to help shape them after we've sculpted them. We can do stereo widening and binaural effects on impulse responses and things like that. So let's just jump right in. I want to make this as concise as possible, as quick as possible, so that you can investigate this further on your own but get a basic understanding. You're looking at this impulse response. One thing to remember is that it's fairly random. So when you're looking at impulse response, that when you really get down and look at it, that it's really random, and keep that in mind. The other thing is if you're looking at impulse response here and you're trying to tune it, why would you want to tune it? For the same reason you'd want to tune your drums to a song. If you watch my video on tuning your drums so that they're basically in key with your song. I know the drummer can't tune his drums on stage, for every song, but the more you work on that, the better the production will sound. Same thing with impulse response. So how do you do that? Well, in your studio, you should have a transpose. You can, all these effects that, when you get done doing any one of these, you want to bounce that piece of audio, render that piece of audio, so that those effects and the things you're doing are rendered onto that impulse response. Every one of the things we're talking about. But anyway, first of all, you can transpose it, and it'll change the spectrum. You can speed it up, slow it down, and that will definitely have an effect on the actual impulse response. And the other thing you can do is something like Melodyne. Melodyne, if you watch the frequency response here and you try to figure out where the initial response is hitting harder, that you can actually throw it in Melodyne or something similar to that and watch the frequency response go up. I mean, you can actually see the frequency response went way up, or you can bring it way down. And what that does is you can actually tune the frequency response to whatever piece of audio that you're working on, so that you can actually tune it to whatever piece of, whatever it would be best tuned to a frequency range for a vocalist, or a drum, and you might have to slightly adjust it for tunings, because the tuning is going to make a difference. And a lot of times in vocals and things like that, you basically want to go look at what note in the key would be best to tune it to, the actual impulse response, and what range you'd want to have it tuned to. And that's a real simple tool, but it will definitely help and make the actual impulse response and the characteristics more complementary to what you're working with. The second thing is going to be shaping the response. So how are you going to shape it? Well, the first thing you can do, you can shape it in a couple different ways. You can shape it with your automation, your volume automation. You can put your volume automation on, and you can shape it before you render that piece of audio down to have a rendered impulse response in a whole different ways with all the different ways you've shaped it. You can get an ADSR tool, or you can get a simple tool like Sculpting here, and to really work on shaping the response, how you want the response to be shaped, so that it has the shape and tail that, the ADSR or those aspects that you're looking at, and really work on shaping that impulse response the way you want it. If you look at download some generic impulse responses, those different aspects will become very obvious to you. So that's the next tool, and why you'd want to do some of that. The other thing is time stretching it. So you can also time stretch your impulse response to where hopefully your studio has some way that you can time stretch your audio, and you can do different ways of stretching your impulse response or compressing it. Sometimes compressing an impulse response can add a lot of different characteristics to it, and make it act a lot more like some other impulse response that you're trying to characterize, because of the way that, the characters of impulse responses and frequency responses and how long they are and how compressed they are, that it's a huge tool for shaping your impulse response. So anything that will do that in your studio, that's a huge tool for shaping it. The next thing is equalization. So when we're talking about equalization, you've seen from the other videos that, I've got this impulse response. Now I've tuned it close to where I want it, and I've, done some tuning work on it. And then, I've showed you these where this is the hall itself, the raw file. And then after I did some equalization on it, and, you can look at the waterfall view of it there, or the spectrogram view of there's the initial response, and there's after some frequency, some equalization I've put on it to actually shape it more the way I want it to sound, so it has a frequency response more of how I want the frequency response. The problem with the EQ is that it will shape all of it. So, but the problem is on the reflections that they may have different frequency responses, but this will generalize it. And most of the time that it does a really good job of you being able to add character of a room with a frequency response that you want, after you've worked on all your impulse response work. And it's a really cool tool to shape the frequency response of your impulse response. And you can do some really cool things with it to actually get a frequency response that you want. You look at a frequency response of like an amp here, one that you have for doing amplification, that you put on your amp sim, and it's like a Marshall cab or something. You can look at the frequency response in that tool, or like a plate reverb. You can put a plate reverb in there and see what the frequency response of it and the impulse response and what it looks like. And you can start working around it to get those type of characteristics into an impulse response that you're working on very easily. The next thing is sound sculpting it. Now, if you went back and watched those videos that I did on sound sculpting, you'll understand that you can do the same thing on this frequency response, meaning you've got this frequency response and you start trying to do some sound sculpting on it in different ways, and that's going to add harmonic characteristics to it, non-harmonic and harmonic and distortion characteristics to your actual frequency response. That's going to add more character. That's a serious generalization, but if you go back and watch the videos I did on sound sculpting and spectral content shaping, that it will become very obvious that you can do those same things to your frequency and impulse response before you even put it in your convolution reverb, so that it's, shaped the way you want it. And you've got a violin and you want it shaped more like a triangle wave for that smoothness. So you actually spend some time sound sculpting that impulse response to where the actual waveform on the scope is coming out looking, instead of looking more, like something, that it's looking more like a violin, the actual waveforms. And looking at that between a spectrometer and a scope, it's a huge tool to help you shape some harmonic content in there. So that's the next tool, and that can be complicated. And like I said, I'm doing a basic outline, so you can go back and watch those videos, and it should be very apparent that your impulse frequency response that you have for your convolution reverb, you can work with it the same way. So what would be the next thing? The next thing is you can actually take other reverbs. So you have another reverb, you're working on this impulse response after you've done all this other work, and so you want to add some dampness to it, or take some away, or you want to do add some population to it, or remove some, or mess with the reflexivity to where it's more reflective or less reflective, the distribution, the size of the room, all those kind of things, some pre-delay. All those things you can take other reverbs you have and then put them on that impulse response and do some sound sculpting on it to really get it the way you want it to sound, so that you have an impulse response on file that has all these characteristics that you've worked at to have, to have that kind of response that you want for, and to have a few of them that are very generic for large and small and medium-sized rooms to work with, that have very good characteristics to begin with, that you can, can add other qualities to very easily for certain applications, and do, tunings and all the stuff we're talking about for specific applications. And I know that sounds complex, but any one of your reverbs, you can even throw your convolution reverb on there that has some, that had some impulse that you kind of like, but it ain't that good, and you can, mix it into it, and then, when you render down that impulse response to a file, that it has some of those characteristics with the characteristics that you've built. So it's a huge tool to help finalize and sculpt that impulse response and frequency response. And the next thing is stereo widening, binaural pans. That's a huge tool. This is a real simple one, but any binaural effects you have, or stereo widening effects, that you can actually put it on that impulse response and listen to it and add some of those effects to your impulse response and then render it down. So it's part of an impulse frequency response file. So it's another huge tool to help you sculpt it. Then what else you do? That if you've really spent some time in those areas and got like this REW and really spent some time looking at, the actual impulse, what it's doing to it, the frequency response and the impulse responses and what all's happened to them as you've been working through it. One of the things about that is that, you basically are going to have to sometimes stop and render down that file, throw it in your convolution reverb with some kind of reference track that you have to test with, and see what it's doing, how it's affecting it, and if it's doing what you think it is. But you should probably get a pretty good idea just from listening to the impulse response. But you'll find that you probably will do that. The other thing is you can actually add other impulse responses. So you can take other impulse responses, overlay them on top of them after you've scoped them to add different characteristics. And your studio probably would have something like overlays, play overlaps. That way you can put them on top of each other and hear them together, and even bounce them together as a separate wave file and work with them like that. And also that if you have stereo responses like that, you can take them and bounce them down to, you can take and transfer it to rendered audio into a mono track. And one of the cool things about that is if you render it down to a mono track like that, excuse me, that wasn't what I was trying to do. If you render it down to a mono track like that, that basically, that if you come down to it like that and you're going to control bounce that, into a mono track, when you take it like that, and okay, now it's mono, that entire impulse response that we just built, right? Well, and if I go back here and I put it back on stereo, and then I control bounce it again, it'll be the same impulse response on either side, so that you're not getting, sometimes it's really good with impulse response to have that stereo effect where it's a little bit different on either side, and sometimes you can do that. And if you can actually take it and sculpt them both just a little bit differently and put one on either side and bounce into a stereo file, it's a huge tool that can really, help you in your sculpting of your impulse response. So I hope that addressed those issues fairly simple, and I know that that's a complex thing to do, but I hope I made it simple enough to where you can go experiment with it, and the concepts of doing it aren't really that complicated, and that you should immediately see, wow, dude, I really can just I can sculpt it myself however I want it, and I've got a file of an impulse response. I throw in my convolution reverb, with some, that is pretty close to what I want, and I can adjust it for different applications. So let's just reiterate going over that. So we addressed tuning it in Melodyne or anything, and why, because if you've got, you want to tune it so it's in key, that doesn't mean you have to tune it way up the spectrum, I mean, even if it stays down the spectrum, that you turn that initial response or the initial impact of that response to being in key is going to help tonally, so that your frequency response is more tonally, complementary to what you're working on. And then shaping the response, with your automations and ADSR tools and tools like that. And your time stretching, your equalization of the frequency response is a huge aspect, because you're shaping the frequency response. If you get a frequency response and you look at it in that REW, that you see that frequency response is trying to show you the characteristics of that room and the frequency response of it. And so you can actually shape that to have the character that you want. And all those other tools, I hope, were very self-explanatory what they're doing and why you'd want to use them to help you shape your own frequency and impulse responses for your convolution reverb. So I hope that was real helpful. I hope I made that simple enough and basic enough to where you could understand it. but it basically opened up some doors for you to start doing those things yourself and not have a billion impulse responses to work with. Peace, hope, love.